Welcome everybody to our 5th webinar in the Volunteer Management webinar series. I can't believe it's already the end of May. So this month we are going to focus on volunteer activity tracking and making sure we're counting everything that we can to show the value of our volunteer programs. I always like to start webinars off with saying that I am not a volunteer expert, though I'm working on it. Volunteerism is my passion, and I love that I've been able to build my career about it, and I learn new things every single day about good and bad things that I'm doing and things that I need to improve on. So I hope these webinars will help you get some ideas on maybe some ways to improve on things that you're already doing with your program. Anything that I suggest are simply best practices from research that I've done. So if you want to implement anything that we're suggesting or that we talk about during the webinars, I ask that you talk it over with your supervisors, with coworkers, or even with your volunteers to make sure that it's okay for you to try and implement some of these new things. So by no means am I requiring you to do anything that we talk about, just some information that may be able to help. So to get us started, we always like to do a recruitment tip of the month every session, since that was kind of the most requested topic to discuss initially when we started the series. So a lot of research that's going on right now is around virtual volunteering and how to get volunteers involved and recruited online. And many organizations are doing a call to action. So some of us are starting to reopen or get into kind of a similar routine, kind of to what we did pre-pandemic. So we have a chance to really revitalize our volunteer programs, almost like a grand reopening of sorts. So we can use the new online tools that we've learned. I had a discussion with Lucille before the webinar got started that we're kind of in a crash course of learning new technologies and learning things that we never thought we may have needed to learn right away. So some of these new resources that we're learning, we can incorporate into these calls for action. So even current volunteers to help re-engage them in the program as well. So things like sending links or attachments to sign up for a newsletter. Or if you don't have a newsletter for your program, maybe they sign up to get monthly or quarterly program updates, just to kind of let people know what's happening. You may want to invite people to an online orientation. It was either last month or, no, it was the month before. In March, we talked about volunteer orientation. So this might be a way to ease into implementing a new orientation by doing it online. Attach a fact sheet or something about your program that's really going to grab the attention of a potential volunteer, and even asking them if you're interested in volunteering for the program. Here's our volunteer application, let's get that on file, and then we'll work on next steps. So having something like a call to action or act now, or something maybe in the heading of your email that is actionable tends to catch the attention of more people, and that's what a lot of the research is showing that has helped many people during the pandemic as everything's starting to get back to quote unquote normal, whatever your normal is. So we've talked a couple times in the last couple webinars about this conference, and I wanted to give everybody one final reminder about it. So Points of Light is an organization that is dedicated to creating a global culture of volunteering. And this year the conference is going virtual, and it's free to attend. So this is a conference that normally I think was around $500-ish to register for, and it was going to be in Washington, D.C. Hey, we can hear you.
Yes, I'm in a seminar. Can I help you? This is Kim. Can I help you?
There we go. We're going to mute Kim. Sorry about that. So it was going to be in person. It's a 3-day training. It goes from June 10th to June 12th, but now it's free to attend from either the comfort of your own home or your office. if you're back at work or maybe your home office that you've created during this time. They did recently release the agenda of speakers and breakout sessions this week. So personally, of course, I'm going to attend the conference. I was able to attend in person one year, and it was amazing. Definitely solidified why I wanted to be in volunteer management as my career. But I'm going to be attending sessions on empowering multi-generational service teams, employee volunteer programs, some sessions on volunteer engagement, retention, and capacity building. So it's going to be some really great information that they'll be sharing. Of course, before you register for this training and this conference, be sure to get approval from your supervisor or anybody that you need to get approval from before registering. And I think quite a few of you, I sent an email about this last month, quite a few of you responded that you've registered, so I hope we'll be attending different sessions and maybe we can talk about what all we learned. So, moving ahead to the topic at hand. So we're going to talk about volunteer tracking today. And there's two really important questions that we're going to look at answering. So kind of the what and the why. So the answers to these questions are going to be different for each of us. Maybe they'll be similar if you're in the same program, but for different programs, these answers are going to be much, much different. And that's okay. So what are we tracking, like our number of volunteers, the activities they're doing, volunteer hours? What we're tracking depends on so many different factors. Just a couple of those factors may be the need of the program in terms of data to be successful, what your supervisor wants, or your board of directors, or if you wrote a grant and you included volunteers in it, what are your funders expecting you from the goals that you've set for yourself? What do the volunteers expect? Kind of what activities are they going to be doing? And the public, what does the public want to know about your program? So there's a lot of different things to consider. Another is, why am I tracking all of this data? We can have so much that we get every month. Volunteers send us a million different things. We ask volunteers for even more stuff. But why do we need to collect everything? Will it help with grant funding in the future? Is this something that we'll be able to put in an application? Is it required by a current grant or your program funding that you already have? Can it assist in recruiting or retaining, recruiting new volunteers or retaining your current volunteers? Does it play a part in the overall program assessment that you do, hopefully on an annual basis, to see if there's any areas that you're doing well in or any areas that you may need to improve on going forward? I think knowing and understanding the why has really helped me personally in taking data collection and analysis a lot more seriously, probably too seriously at times. A lot of people that I've worked with in certain programs, I can be a little overbearing and kind of bombard people with data, and half of it, people are like, I don't understand what she's trying to talk about. So, but understanding the why is really going to help kind of, if you have the mentality of, man, I really don't like tracking things, or this is taking up a lot, and it does. Data collection takes up a lot of our time. Hopefully, understanding the why you're doing these things will help change that mentality too. This is actually really, really beneficial. One of the biggest pieces of advice that was given in nearly all of the books and articles and resources that I've read is, if you're not going to use the data that you're collecting, why are you tracking it? So this could be for any of the reasons that we've already mentioned. You know, it could be a requirement for one reason or another. But my hope is by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to look at what you're currently tracking and understand the why, and also why it may not be important to track. And there may be some things you can discuss to cease tracking or track a little bit less, and possibly finding a few new things that are important to track that you may not have thought about. But I really want you all to take some notes, and you know, if something catches your attention, you know, jot it down, and then go back to your supervisor, your coworkers, and even your volunteers, and get feedback on what you feel is important to focus on collecting, get their input on what they feel is important to collect, see if those things match up, and understand their why they want you to track certain things. And maybe it'll help put a new outlook on some things that you haven't considered to track yet as well. So in terms of volunteers, there's some common things that probably everyone is tracking right now. So the total number of your volunteers you want to have. It doesn't matter if your total number is 10 or 100. Really the number of volunteers, in my opinion, and this could be different, there are certain goals and things that people need to meet. But if you only have a handful of volunteers and that's all the volunteers you need to make your program successful and all the needs of your clients and services are being provided, you don't have to have 100. You know, if you're in a small rural county and you don't have necessarily a whole lot of people, I'm sure there's a lot of people in the rural areas. I'm doing a lot of assuming, which probably isn't a good thing. But if your program serves 20 people in a city maybe, or a tiny town, you may only need 5 volunteers. You probably don't need 20 volunteers to get your goals. So the number is important to track, but I don't want to come off as if you don't have a high number, your volunteer program isn't doing well. It's really going to depend on the need that you have in your area. 5 could cover it. You may need 10. You may need the 100. But tracking that total number is very important. So in Tennessee, I've heard these 2 terms used quite a bit. So you have a difference between true volunteers and in-kind volunteers. And some of this relates to some programs more than others. But to kind of define these 2 different types of volunteers, a true volunteer doesn't have any association or affiliation with another organization. So this could be a retiree, maybe it's an intern who doesn't have a job yet and they're doing their internship with you, someone who may be unemployed, who's looking for employment, who needs to improve their skills, and they look to your volunteer program to get those skills. Whereas an in-kind volunteer is someone who is working for an organization that already serves the population that you're serving, and they're able to do their volunteer work as part of their current job. You're not paying them, but their employer says, you know, for example, I'm a service coordinator at a senior housing complex. Well, it's good for that service coordinator to know how to screen for extra help for the Medicare program, so their residents can receive assistance with paying for their medication. So they may be a SHIP volunteer. Maybe they want to do an exercise program for their participants to help reduce falls, and they may be a SAIL volunteer. So they're actually doing the service and the volunteer work while they're on the clock at their current job. And again, like I said, this applies for some programs over other programs. You can also kind of use this as terms of volunteers who don't have any kind of professional experience to a professional volunteer. Maybe you have a graphic designer that's helped you with your website, or a pharmacist comes in to do a presentation every month and check medications for participants at the senior center, something along those lines. That's a professional volunteer that could be considered also an in-kind volunteer. And just to remind you all, feel free to type in questions or any comments that you have as we're going through. In terms of volunteers, you also want to track the years of service. This is going to help in showing your retention efforts. So if you have a volunteer that's only done maybe 1 event and then you haven't heard from them again, you know, it's a short-term volunteer. Those are good. We don't want to discount any volunteers that have done 1 thing or that have done a million things for us. But years of service is a good thing to track. It may also help in some recognition efforts if you do some incentive things. You also want to track the service area that the volunteer is doing the work in. So especially in our rural areas, we may be able to track, all right, we have 5 volunteers in this county, we only have 1 in this county, so this may be where we need to focus some of our recruitment in to help those individuals who need meals or rides or something along those lines. Or if a special need comes up, maybe there's we've had, unfortunately, quite a few tornadoes that have come through Tennessee in the last couple months. You can look through your volunteer list and say, hey, I have 50 volunteers who are in Hamilton County. Maybe if I partner with one of our local emergency shelters and they say, hey, we need 10 volunteers to help out on this Saturday, I can see if any of our volunteers in Hamilton County are interested in serving in another capacity that's maybe helping older adults who've been affected by a tornado or whatever it could be. And you also want to look at demographics. This is really going to be important when it comes to funding purposes. You want to show kind of the diversity of your volunteer program. So some things to track may be your age of your volunteers. It doesn't have to be individual years necessarily. I know a lot of us put date of birth on the volunteer application, but you may want to lump them into just different categories, like so many people over 65, so many people under, or 10-year increments, or however you want to track that. Race, ethnicity, gender, and language is spoken are a really important factor that a lot more organizations are taking into consideration, depending on if they're in more of an urban setting that has a multicultural presence. So I do want to show you all some data that the SHIP program, the State Health Insurance Assistance Program, tracks that kind of shows a lot of this in a really unique format. And I did get permission from the SHIP director to share this with you all. So what I was able to do, since I am a SHIP volunteer, I'm an in-kind volunteer with SHIP, I was able to look at data from 2018, the full year from January 1 to December 31st, 2018, and compare that to January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2019. I will say this data might be a tiny bit skewed as they did transition to a new database. I believe it was kind of mid-2018, early 2019. So either way, it's going to give you a really good picture of all these things that I've suggested you record and how it can help you see the improvements or ways you need to improve from year to year. So you can see SHIP tracks the years of service. So in a year, they've increased volunteers quite a bit who've had less than 1 year of service. And you can also look back through the program and try and find factors that could contribute to that. So for example, SHIP does a lot with pharmacy students. So you may have some pharmacy students that help 1 year, but they may not help the next. So they would be in the short-term, maybe episodic volunteers that have less than 1 year of service. And you can see their increments here. So they've really increased the volunteers who have more than 5 years of experience from 1 year to another. They also track age, just in 2 general categories, whether it's less than 65 or younger than 65 or older than 65. And you can see kind of the differences between the 2 charts. I apologize, it might be a little small on your screen. They have the gender. You can compare that. They have the race, ethnicity, and then they have those languages spoken. So we'll talk quite a bit later toward the end of the presentation about how you track all of this information. The SHIP and SMP program is unique and they have their own data system through their grantor, through their funder. So that's how we're able to pull this data for their program relatively easily and kind of do a quick analysis of it. Other programs aren't that lucky. So a lot of us, like me, use Excel spreadsheets or maybe something different. But this is a kind of a good picture on the benefits of tracking this data from year to year. So thank you to the SHIP SMP program for allowing me to share that data and keep up the great work, guys. Training is another thing that you want to track throughout the year and from year to year if you haven't already done so. So the first thing, and this is quite a new concept to quite a few of us when we talked a couple months ago about it, myself included, So you want to track, as you're doing orientations, if you've done them forever or if you've just now starting orientations, you want to track the number of new people that are coming to that orientation. You know, it doesn't have to be a long orientation. I think when we talked a couple months ago, it was about 45 minutes to an hour of an orientation. It's not a full-on training. It's just kind of getting the 10,000-foot view of the program. So you can track who attends orientation and see how many of those individuals actually attend your initial training, or the training to actually become a volunteer, to learn what you need to do for whichever activity they want to volunteer for. So it's sort of a retention mechanism. I wouldn't count necessarily, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but in terms of retention, I wouldn't count it negatively toward your volunteer retention if your orientation doesn't lead to a lot of volunteers coming to the initial training. Because like I said, orientation is that 10,000-foot view just to put feelers out to see if anyone's interested. They get the nuts and bolts. Hopefully it'll help people come to initial training. It also helps weed out those individuals who may not be as interested in as what they thought, which isn't a bad thing. But we all know that our initial trainings, you know, some could be a few hours, some could be a couple days. It takes a lot of time and energy to do those trainings. And you do want to see a reward at the end of it. You hope to see, I believe the statistic was a third of the volunteers who attend initial training don't actually do any volunteer work. So we talked that hopefully that orientation will help weed out some of that 1/3, and you'll be able to get a higher retention rate from the initial trainings that you have. You also want to track, if you do this, and some of your programs may do this and some of your programs may not. Just like with anything, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are some things you may be tracking, some things you may not be tracking. So some of this applies to you, some of it may not. And for those things that do not apply to you, it may apply in the future. You may find it beneficial after this presentation. But you also want to track any of the people who've gone through initial training, who are volunteering or who are working to get a volunteer opportunity position, to see how many of them are going to participate in any of your update trainings that you have. So additional training throughout the year to current volunteers is an excellent retention strategy. And we'll talk more about retention in a couple months, but it shows the volunteers that you want to continue to improve on their skills that they have, and a lot of them will come back to learn more information, get some updates to help them serve the population that we're helping through our programs. We also want to track our activities. So I've mentioned this in almost every webinar, and anyone, let's see if anybody knows the answer to this. You can type it into the chat box. What do I always say is the most important document that you will have to give a volunteer? What's the most important document of your volunteer program? Give everybody a minute to type that in the chat box. Mission statement. That is definitely an extremely important part. Everyone needs to know their mission, definitely. Not exactly what I was thinking, but you do have, I'm probably, in my opinion, on the most important document is probably not the most important document. The mission statement is extremely important. Yes, the volunteer role description is probably, in my opinion, and it may not be a popular opinion, but in my personal opinion, the volunteer role description or job description or whatever you want to title it, it can be called many different things. But the volunteer role description is the most important document that you're going to have for your volunteer program. It's going to contain your mission statement. It should have the mission in there as well. So as you're looking at your activities, pull out those volunteer role descriptions. Those are your activities. So I just kind of gave a couple examples from all of our programs. So if you're a volunteer with the CREVA program, it might be helping someone who's been a victim of financial exploitation. If you're a volunteer with the Dementia Capable program, you may have gone through the Powerful Tools for Caregivers training, and you may be one of those instructors to help caregivers learn those tools that they need. You may be a volunteer for the guardianship program and help individuals who aren't able to make those financial decisions as they get older and they don't have additional family members, or unfortunately they may have been a victim of abuse as well and they need someone to help with those decisions. You may be a My Ride driver to take people to the grocery store or the doctor. You may be a volunteer ombudsman and do a visit to the nursing home. Or you're with the nutrition program and you help with meal delivery, or you help in the kitchen during lunch or at the congregate meal sites. You could be a SAIL volunteer and you teach an exercise and fitness class. Or you're a SHIP SMP counselor and you talk to people on the phone about their Medicare benefits and help them with any questions that they have. You could be a Tennessee Person-Centered Music Program volunteer where you help create a playlist for an older adult who may have some cognitive disabilities like Alzheimer's or dementia, and really help them kind of with their music. It'll help their cognitive function. And I apologize, I volunteered for the program and I just can't put the words together, but it's a great program to help those individuals, you know, who may be more lethargic, who don't communicate very well. They'll listen to their music and it's almost like they come alive. Or you may be a volunteer at the senior center. Maybe you're working the front desk or you teach a program or something along those lines. So those are just a couple examples of the hundreds probably of activities that we have to do in all 10 of our programs that have a volunteer component. So it's important for us to track not only the total number of volunteers that we have, but the number of volunteers that we have in each of those volunteer roles. So for example, with the SHIP SMP program, and I do say this every webinar as well, I apologize for only using certain programs as examples. I tend to go with the programs that I know most about. Obviously, I didn't know as much about the Tennessee Person-Centered Music Program as I fumbled on that description, but I do know the SHIP SMP program. So there are 5 different volunteer roles for the SHIP SMP program. So we need to see how many volunteers fit into each of those 5 roles. Now, granted, there's 5 different role descriptions, but they can really be broken down into about 3 different actual activities. So you have a counselor, you have a public and media person who does presentations and outreach, and then you have admin individuals who help with data and filing and things like that. So if you can break them down into those categories, you'll be able to see maybe where you have some gaps. Trying to look to see who that is. Here we go. So helping see where those gaps are and where you may need some additional volunteers, or maybe you are able to combine some of your volunteer role descriptions into one. If you only have 2 or 3 volunteers in one of the roles, maybe you look at your other ones to see if that can be encompassed into an already existing volunteer role. Another way to kind of assess the program. There are also some activities that we may forget to track. And when I say we may forget, I really mean that I'm the one who's forgotten to track these things in the past or in the present, I'll be honest. So I want to see if you all are smarter than I am and are tracking these things like you're supposed to. So are you tracking, and again, feel free to type in comments and questions as you go along, but are you all tracking the time it takes your volunteers to get to and from an activity? So for example, if your volunteer is doing a community presentation somewhere about the My Ride program or Meals on Wheels or whatever it may be, and it's in a town 30 minutes away, and it's an hour presentation, are you giving the volunteer just an hour as their volunteer time, or are you giving them the full 2 hours of the time it took them to travel to and from that presentation? Some of you may, some of you may not. Some of you may have specific limitations in your volunteer funding or your grants that you get that says, volunteer travel doesn't count for this particular grant. So you may not. It's good to see that some people are. I see that in the chat box. Great. Are we tracking the time volunteers go out and actually distribute materials? Maybe they come to the office and they pick up 100 flyers and they say, yeah, I'm going to go to a couple pharmacies and I'll drop these off, or I'll go to the libraries and drop these off. Great, here we go. We're going to give you those and kind of let them loose. Do we ever follow up with that volunteer to see how long it took them to distribute those? Many people do. I have forgotten in the past. Likewise, do we count the time that volunteers, write articles for the newspaper or write an op-ed or help with the newsletter or do some web content and things like that? We did get a comment that you also count travel time from volunteers home to the volunteer assignment. That's great. And the last thing is, do we count the time that volunteers get interviewed for certain things? So we have quite a few volunteers right now that are being interviewed for certain programs to get some publicity out there due to the pandemic. And I have forgotten to ask those volunteers and follow up with them, and I'm doing it now, but initially I forgot to ask them, hey, how long were you on the phone with such and such reporter, or how long did it take to wrap up that TV interview or radio spot, just to get that information as well. So already it sounds like you guys are way more effective at your data collection than I am, which is great. So our volunteer activity hours. Time is our most precious resource. I think we can all agree with that. You can have my money, but don't waste my time. The same thing applies for our volunteers. The one thing that volunteers dislike the most is when they volunteer, they say we can do something and they're not effectively utilized. Maybe they're standing around or they're sitting with not much to do. So we need to make sure when a volunteer says something along the lines of, I can come into the office 4 hours a certain day a week, that we have enough activity for them to do, whether it's filing, data entry, helping with reporting, research on some projects, anything that you can think of that you need help with that the volunteer can do. If they say they can do 4 hours, but it's been a slower week. With the pandemic, we haven't had as much data come in. We would love for you to come into the office, but we may only need you for 2 of those 4 hours. Because you don't want them to work for 2 hours and then sit around for another 2. Or, just simply say, hey, if you're done with this, you can leave whenever you're done. Same thing with large events. A lot of our volunteers want to help with things like health fairs or expos or conferences that come along. Maybe they're able to help with some aspect of the event or the conference, like helping with registration or being a moderator or something along those lines. Or they may help the organization itself by manning a booth at the event. It's going to be an 8-hour day. We need someone to pass out materials and answer questions. Give them an expectation. I know I've been to plenty of events where there's, especially for conferences and expos and things like that, there's usually a heavy traffic time. So there's usually an agenda where you can say, hey, between 10 and 10:30, there's a break from any of the sessions, so you'll probably get a lot more traffic around this time. But, between 9 and 10, most of the people are going to be in a session, so you may not get as much traffic. So that way they don't feel like their time's being wasted. I hope that makes sense. Just kind of setting that expectation that, yeah, there is going to be a little bit of downtime, but I hope that they'll still find that the time is going to be valuable that they spend there. I've seen a lot of organizations, especially for manning tables and booths and things like that in an all-day event, break the day up into different shifts. So maybe 2 hours before lunch, 2 hours after lunch. The organization and the kind of the coordinators really look at when those peak traffic times are going to be and schedule the time frame around that to kind of cut down on the time of volunteers just kind of sitting and maybe not doing anything. So something else to consider. Many programs across the world, not just in our state or even in our country, but across the world, put a lot of emphasis on our volunteer hours. And I will admit that is definitely a big focus of mine. Heck, I ask you guys to send me your volunteer hours every month. Of course, I think it's important. However, making those hours valuable is truly the key. You may have a low number of volunteer hours in your program. That's fine. If those hours are making an impact on the populations that you serve and are valuing the time that everyone has that's involved, whether it's you or the volunteer or anybody else, then I say it's a success. So there is a highly debated discussion going on amongst a lot of professionals on placing a value on volunteer time and if it's harmful or not. So we are going to get into a little bit of that debate and some resources that I found. But I do want to let you all know there is a value that you can put on a volunteer hour. Nationally, a volunteer hour is worth $25.43. Here in Tennessee, specifically, it's a little bit lower at $22.67. And these numbers are generated on an annual basis from the independent sector, which I believe I don't know of a volunteer organization that doesn't use the independent sector as an extremely credible source for these numbers. Any research that I did always cited independent sector, so these are accurate numbers. The reason why we have two different numbers is really based on where your funding is coming from. So if you get a national grant, you're competing against other states, yeah, you want to use that national number. You want to use the $25.43. But if you're looking for state money, or maybe you get a grant through one of the state departments or a local Tennessee foundation, let's see. Trying to see who that background noise is, so I'm just muting a bunch of people. So if you're getting money from the state itself or a state foundation, it may be better to use that state number. And usually when it looks like, when you're looking at applications and grants to apply for, typically they'll lay out which number they prefer you to use, or you can always ask the funder which number that they would like you to use. And I agree, most people who work would love to be making $22.67. I agree. Unfortunately, that's not the reality, but when it comes to volunteer time and the value, that's what it's assessed at. And it's steadily increasing every year. Making sure I got my notes. I have some feelers out to some of my volunteer management colleagues across the country. There has been some conversation, and I wasn't able to find official numbers, and I'm hoping that they'll be able to help me out with that, that some activities are actually worth more or less than that $25 or $22. For example, there's some resources that may say training hours are worth a little bit more than activity hours or vice versa. Activities that are done by professionals have a higher value than maybe a volunteer who's not a professional in a certain area. So I don't have those numbers specifically, but as I get that feedback from some of my colleagues, I'll be sure to let you guys know. For example, if a doctor comes and does a presentation, their value may be higher at $100 an hour or something along those lines. But I'm working to get that confirmed. The other side of the debate is the social aspect of volunteering. So the activities the volunteers are doing to make an impact or a change in the lives of people we serve. So the big debate right now, and there's a really great article through eVolunteerism, an electronic journal that I have a subscription to, that's titled, "Is Assigning Financial Value to Volunteering a Good Idea?" And it's a really great article of the dialogue from a roundtable discussion of 3 panelists and a moderator. I believe 2 panelists are from Canada and 1 is from the independent sector that actually kind of generates those numbers on the screen. So it's a good argument for both sides. And if you're interested, I'm happy to send you that article in a follow-up email if anyone's interested in kind of hearing both sides of it. But kind of my very brief book review or article review is I definitely understand why we put a financial value on our volunteer work. It's not free labor. That's a lot of kind of misconception about volunteerism is it's people who are working for free. Not really. It helps us to show the overall value of the programs that we're running in our services. But one panelist comes flat out and says that putting a monetary value on volunteer work can be extremely harmful and a very dangerous slippery slope because volunteering has always been focused on mission and the social impact. And I definitely see that side of the argument as well. But the monetary value we assign for volunteer activities is something really for our grant funders and maybe our elected officials, sort of the money talks type mentality. However, the public, as you're promoting your program in your communities across the state, whatever it may be, isn't going to care about how much money the volunteer program is worth necessarily. They're going to want to know the social side of things and what you're accomplishing and how it's helping the overall community that you serve. So we had a question, doesn't that number include what it costs to have them as a staff member, such as office space, materials, and insurance? Yes, I believe the national and Tennessee number that you're seeing on the screening is kind of all encompassing of the activity and almost as if they were an employee, what their value in terms of any kind of overhead, insurance and stuff like that. Yes, I believe that is correct. So it's an interesting debate, and I'm curious to see any of your input about that debate. Do you kind of see it as both sides are important? Do you see one side being more important than the other? So I'll let some of you type your response in the chat box, and I'll also open up some lines to see if anybody on the call has any input in this debate. So as I'm opening up lines, does anybody have any input on the debate? There's really no wrong answer to this, in my opinion. You know, it's definitely dependent probably on your program and things like that. So we have a comment that it's definitely, it can be a powerful tool with managers and funders. Absolutely. Our smaller center calculated the last fiscal year, we had volunteer hours about $8 an hour, and it would cost the center $165,000 at just an $8 per hour rate. So. Alrighty, I think I'm getting more feedback than people with any comments. Alrighty, a lot of people who don't understand volunteer management do understand volunteer numbers. Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. Great. So anyone else who has any comments, please feel free to share them in the chat box. I'm going to start to mute people again. We're getting some background noise. But it is an interesting debate, and especially in the article that I read, there's some unique perspectives that you can agree to disagree on, but there are some good, well thought out, of course, points to be made on both sides. I will say we're still going to be looking at volunteer activity hours for the foreseeable future. That's for sure. It's not going to go away. So also tracking your picture stories and testimonials. These are super important. It's not necessarily data, but you want that quantitative aspect of your program, but you also want the qualitative stuff. And that's probably as language jargon as I'm going to get. But so you see some pictures here that I've received either via our Facebook page or people who have submitted some stuff. So we have some East Tennessee My Ride volunteers here at the bottom left corner in the green. We have some ladies who've helped out in Loudoun County in the kitchen through the Make a Difference Monday campaign that we've been doing. Got some people participating in a sail exercise class, an individual who's doing kind of a takeout order for the Meals on Wheels program. Especially during the pandemic, that program has kind of changed to people who normally would come to a commodity food, or a congregate meal site, may come and do pickup orders, or they've changed to meal delivery, home delivery. There's a picture of that. And then this bottom picture, we had a SHIP SMP volunteer conference a couple years ago, and we were able to do a group picture of everyone who came by. So all of those pictures can tell a great story for your program. And of course, we've gotten permission from all of these individuals to use their photo, which is a little bit more paperwork, but you definitely want that peace of mind and those protocols in place. Okay, the stories. The stories are going to help a lot in really and volunteer recruitment, in letting the public know what all's going on. Your board of directors are going to want to know the stories. I'll never forget, we were at a commission meeting, which is like our board of directors meeting, and one of our directors gave a few, not all of our commission members, a piece of paper to read that was a great story that happened throughout the year for that program. So it was a great way to get some interaction from our commission members, but also have, instead of us just sharing stories because they hear from us all the time, it was actually them hearing about the great and good news stories from their peers. And it really helped show the impact, that qualitative impact of the program. And you also want your testimonials. You want testimonials from your clients that says, hey, my volunteer has done a great job, from the volunteers that say why they love to volunteer for the program. We're collecting a lot through the Make a Difference Monday campaign that we're doing. I believe we have submissions all the way at least until mid-August. So for those of you who may not know about the Make a Difference Monday campaign, many of you do, as I'm looking at who all is on the webinar today. A lot of you have submitted people. But we ask for volunteers to fill out a form and submit their picture and ask them why they enjoy volunteering for the program that they're volunteering for. And it's really been great. It's helped publicize a lot of our programs. We do the post every Monday. It's a different volunteer and typically a different program every week. And if you want to see that, it's on the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disabilities Facebook page. So I know the ladies from Loudoun County were highlighted just here a couple weeks ago. I do have a question for you guys, and I'm sure many of you do this, but when you get something from a client, say it's a meal delivery client or a SHIP SMP client, and they send an email or a note to someone that says, hey, so-and-so, I talked to them, or they came to see me a couple weeks ago and they really helped me and lifted my spirits and the volunteer program is amazing. Do you all share those with your volunteers? Just send them a quick note and say, hey, we heard from so-and-so that you did a great job and we just want to really thank you and let you know that what you're doing is appreciated, and not only us, but the people that we serve are seeing how valuable you are. Awesome. I got it. Of course we are. Perfect. But having those, keeping those in your arsenal to be able to promote the program is really great. You want to use your data. So I kind of stressed this at the beginning of the webinar. If you're not going to use it, why are you tracking it? You can use it in quite a few fun ways. Now, I'm not super technologically savvy, as we've talked about many a time, so I was able to steal at least one thing. So this is kind of a volunteer infographic, and many of you may do this already, and if you do, I would love to see kind of what you've developed. But this is for the Make-A-Wish Foundation in the Greater Bay Area. So they took all of the data that they're collecting, and they were able to put it in kind of a fun, easier to read format where it's got their mission up at the top, which is a little blurred out. You probably can't read it, but it does say their mission and kind of what they do, and what their oldest and youngest volunteer is, how many wishes they've granted, for how long they've been in service, the number of volunteers and their volunteer hours. Notice the volunteer hours are still important to them, but they didn't put that monetary value on it for the public. Of course, this is going out to a lot of people. The languages that they speak, the ratio of female to male, how many miles their volunteers span. I didn't even think about our volunteers cover so many miles. I think that's a great idea. I didn't even come to my mind. But I think this is a great way to use that data that we're collecting if we haven't already done so. And some of you may have, and like I said, please share that with me. I'd love to see some of that. Something that I did for our SAIL program, that's the Stay Active and Independent for Life. It's a strength, balance, and fitness program, is for the first year kind of wrap up for our grant. I put this together using Shutterfly. I don't know if you all know what Shutterfly is. Probably most of you do. It's an online photo service where you can create different collages and books and stuff like that. So I was able to use that, put a bunch of photos in of our volunteers, of classes and participants, and then give them the impact and the data that they helped generate. So, you know, we had 21 SAIL workshops in so many counties, over 25,000 hours of exercise that they were instrumental in collecting. If it wasn't for our volunteers, there may be, or there wouldn't be any older adults participating in the SAIL exercise class. So not only do you want to show the impact to the community as a whole, but you can also use this data to show either your entire group of volunteers, their impact, or we'll talk more about this next week with the recognition and things. But as you track individual volunteer efforts, you can show individually their impact and send them, you know, an anniversary note or a birthday card or something along, a thank you note, something along those lines. So finding creative ways to use the data, send it to your elected officials, give it to your board members. All of our commission members got the red picture here of what we sent to our SAIL leaders. So they were able to kind of see the impact that way. So a new concept that I don't know if I totally am on board with just yet, but a new concept that came up in many, many, many of the articles and research that I did was showing the return on investment of your volunteer program. Now, it's a new thing, so it may become more popular in the future. I don't know if it's super popular right now, but I like to try and stay ahead of the game when we can. So it's a very simple, well, it may not be as simple as what I'm portraying it as, but I found the simplest formula to show the return on investment. And this is something you all can do when you have the time, if it's something that you're interested in, maybe showing to certain people, your supervisors, board of directors, people like that. So the return on investment is your volunteer rate, which and I'll show you an example of what I did. Your volunteer rate minus your program cost divided by your program cost equals your return on investment. So I was decent at math in school, but when numbers and stuff and words got involved, it kind of went in one ear, out the other. So I always like to see examples of things. So I tried to put one together for you. And like I said, I go back to certain programs that I'm involved with. So I apologize, I'm not getting a wide variety of examples. But I'm going to use the SAIL program, the Stay Active and Independent for Life program, as my return on investment example. So this example is going to show the first 2 years of grant funding for the SAIL program. The total program cost for the grant for the first 2 years was $100,761. And that includes all expenses. It includes staff time, it includes my insurance, it includes any materials that were purchased, travel, training, you name it. That was our budget for the first 2 years. Granted, we still have about another month to go before we kind of spend all that money, but for the sake of the example, we're going to say we spent it all. Our volunteer rate, and since it is a federal grant, I use the $25.43 an hour rate. Our volunteers contributed a little over 8,200 hours. So that, if you do the math, is around $208,627. And if we use our formula, we got the volunteer rate minus the program cost, leaves about $107,866. So if I divide that, again, by the program cost, the result is for the first 2 years, for every dollar that was invested through this grant, $1.07 is returned to the community. I couldn't tell you if that's a good or a bad thing. We have another year, so I hope that that number can increase. I'm happy that at least it's over $1 of the return on investment, and that just includes the volunteer rate. It doesn't include certain other things that possibly could count. But if that's something that you're interested in looking into, that's kind of the formula and one example of how to do it. I don't know if grant funders or anyone is going to be interested in this, again, like I said, in the future, but it is something that I noticed popping up more and more that I wanted to make you guys aware of. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I did the math right. If I didn't do the math right, someone check my math and then tell me in a personal email, and don't call me out in front of everybody, please. Thank you. The logic model. So this is another model that came up in many articles in the research that I did. So the logic model is one of those things that you learn in college that you didn't think that you were going to actually use, like SMART goals in your profession. That you can actually go to your professor, or your professor is going to kind of do an "I told you so," and said, "See, I told you were going to use this." That's how I felt when I noticed the logic model coming up so much. So the logic model is going to use inputs that enable activities that generate outputs that result in outcomes to contribute to your goals. And I'm going to go over each individual one of those parts. So the first one, your inputs. These include things like what your volunteers and the staff do, any kind of human resources, financial, organizational, and community resources available to carry out program activities. So for example, these are things like your funding, your program staff, your volunteers, and your training. All of those things are kind of lumped into your inputs. Inputs enable you to do your activities. Your activities are the processes, tools, events, and actions that are used to bring about programs intended to change or have a result. So for example, presentations that you do about your programs or services, health fairs you may do, delivering meals, teaching a class, so on and so forth. So those are your activities. Everything that we talked about in that previous slide that I gave some good and not so good examples of. Then you have your outputs. So those are the direct products of your program's activities, and may include the types of activities, levels, any kind of targets of service that you have to be delivered by your program. So for example, outputs include the number of individuals who received a meal or a ride to the doctor or the grocery store, or the number of people who attended a presentation, event, or a class, or how many people came to the senior center that day or week or month, or however you all track that. So those are your outputs. Outcomes are the expected changes in the population served that are the result of your program activities. So for example, changes in knowledge or skills. So again, I'll use SAIL as an example since that's kind of my comfort zone. So the people who participate in SAIL know more ways to prevent a fall. That's an outcome. It may change their behavior or action. So the participants then go home after a sale class and they assess their home to determine any fall risk, and they remove any kind of hazardous elements like maybe a rug or a cord or other items they may trip on. So it's kind of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals, so to speak. And then changes in condition or status in life. So people we've seen in the SAIL program started class using wheelchairs, walkers, and canes. And after, 6 months to a year participating in the class, they need less assistance with mobility, and some no longer need any assistance at all. So it also helps the individual, making them more independent and able to do more and have, a better quality of life. And then all of these elements, all 4 of these bad boys, go into relating back to your goals and the impact you want to have on the population that you're serving. So the goal of SAIL is to prevent falls in adults over 65. We're able to see the reduction in falls in our participants through the program. And eventually, once new fall data comes from Tennessee, we're able to see if our program maybe had any kind of impact on the decrease in the number of falls across the state. Granted, it wouldn't be our program that would cause all falls to decrease, but I think we would play a significant role in the 2,500 people that we have in our SAIL classes right now. If they didn't fall and didn't contribute to that number, I think we can say we played a little bit of a role in that. So I do have some homework for you guys. Normally I do polls and things like that. I don't have any polls today, but I do have a little bit of homework for you. What I'd like you guys to do is do a logic model of your program. So look at all of these, your inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. I would love if you'd be willing to share this with me. You don't have to, but I think it would be really great to see some logic models from your programs if you're willing to do that. Format doesn't matter. It can be handwritten, it can be typed out, whatever's comfortable. But try to list all of your inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then maybe in a paragraph or 2, relate it back to the impact you're having on your community and your goals. This could really help you develop a new outreach presentation to the community or guide you through your next program update to staff, volunteers, supervisors, boards of directors, elected officials, whoever you want to talk to about your program. And it's another good tool to assess the strengths and maybe some improvements that you need in your programs. So if anyone's willing to do that and share it with me, I'd love to see it. I'll give you some feedback and I'm sure some praise. How to track. I said we were going to touch on this just a little bit, and I am not an expert by any means on how to track this data. I do it many different ways. So some of us are lucky enough to have a volunteer management software system. I know, for example, the Greater Nashville Regional Council, their area agency on aging and disability, has a volunteer management system that, from what I can see, is really good and helps organize a whole lot of stuff. Some of us may not be as lucky. Maybe it's due to funding, or I know where I work, we have to get certain permissions for outside software and contracts and things of that nature. So maybe there's some obstacles that some of us face in doing that. And I'd have to do a lot of research to give you specifics on the different ones that are out there. There's many, many different options. Some of us, like I mentioned with the SHIP SMP program, the program has their own data systems that they're required to input into. So if you already have a system, you're required, whether it's, I believe it's STARS for the SHIP SMP program, or if you have a different one for your program, I have to track our data in the National Falls database for SAIL. Does it really make sense to track data in 2 different systems? You may not need it. You may already have it in place. And then there's other people like myself who do the lovely Excel spreadsheet because you have to track it some way, and Excel will let you auto sum some numbers. So I've used Excel, I've used individual, I've kind of used all 3 depending on where I've been and some volunteer opportunities that I've been able to participate in. I've had experience with all 3, but in terms of consistency and what I use most often, I use that Excel spreadsheet. If you have any other ways or suggestions on how you all track volunteer data, please feel free to type it in the chat box. I'm happy to share with everybody who's on the call. Oh, and there's, yes, thank you. So the area agencies on aging and disability use a system called SAMS, or Harmony, it may be called, something along those lines. I know at least it's called SAMS at one point. So they track a lot of their data through that system. I know it's a lot of program data. Not sure if a lot of volunteer data is in there. Could very well be. I don't know. I'm not as familiar with that system. But what I kind of want to emphasize through this how to track is if you can avoid doing double data entry, it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache. So definitely you have to talk with your supervisors and anybody else to get approval to use certain things. These are just, again, suggestions, not requirements. Whatever's going to be best for you and your program is what I highly recommend that you all do. Good. Volunteer data can be submitted in SAMS. Awesome. I didn't know that. So to wrap up, just a few takeaways from the webinar today that I hope you can use. I found this comic strip and I thought it was great. Get all the information you can. We'll think of how to use it later. Try not to have that mentality. I have that mentality sometimes. I'd rather have more data than less, or I want to try and predict what my supervisors or what other people may want to know. And in my way of trying to think ahead and think of the big picture, I just put more work on myself, and then no one may care about certain aspects that I'm collecting. So make sure that you have those discussions and see exactly what's important and what you need to focus on collecting. The phrase, use it or lose it. Remember, if you're not going to use that data, why are you collecting it? See if there's something that you can take off your plate. Again, as long as it's approved by your supervisor and whoever else you need to get approval from. If there's something that you're tracking that you're not using, is it okay that we stop tracking it? Not to say that you may not need to track it in, 5-10 years down the line, but see if there's something that can be added or deleted from what you're currently doing. Everything, just as always, anything that we talk about is always going to relate back to your mission and vision of your program and of your overall organization. So whatever data you're collecting, make sure that it's relating back somehow. However you're going to communicate this data. If you say your mission is to prevent falls in older adults, well, we have X number of volunteers who do X number of volunteer hours that resulted in X number of exercise hours for individuals that we can contribute to a reduction in falls through education and blah, 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 blah. Obviously, I didn't prepare that, and I just kind of sprung that out there. But make sure everything relates back to that mission and vision. And then welcome any kind of feedback. Not all feedback is positive, you're doing excellent. Some feedback can be constructive criticism. Try not to think of it as criticism. But make sure you, again, talk with your supervisors, talk with your coworkers. Volunteers really want to give their feedback, and they'll give you honest feedback if you ask them, hey, we're looking at the data that we're collecting. Is there anything that you want to know about your impact you're having on the program? And that'll help you say, okay, from a volunteer perspective, they really want to know how many meals are getting served every month, or how many rides are being done in a specific county, or something along those lines. So getting feedback, making sure your volunteers are being heard and you're having that open dialogue with everyone that you can, I think is going to be really, really important as a takeaway to this. So I don't have any updates on anything else that I can think of. We have had more people report some volunteer data for the volunteer campaign that I'm doing to track volunteers and volunteer hours across the state. I mentioned on last webinar that we met our goal. So we have over 2,020 volunteers. I believe we're closer to 2,200 now with thousands of hours of service. I apologize. It's been a crazy month and I haven't really been able to, use my Excel spreadsheets to do that auto sum and track everything like I should be. But I will have an update for you all next month. But I just can't thank you all enough for your continued amazing work and getting everything done and even going above and beyond with that extra step and sending me the information. Again, it's not required. I just really appreciate it. And for those of you who are doing that, it's really, really showing the impact. I'm excited for our next commission meeting that hopefully won't be as focused on the pandemic, so I can share with our commission members the amazing work that you're doing. So keep up the great work. And I do want to let you know our next webinar is going to be Friday, June 19th at 10 o'clock a.m. Central Time, 11 o'clock Eastern Time. We're going to look at volunteer recognition, so easy and cost-effective ways to appreciate your volunteers. I really like that cost-effective title. So I know a lot of us, funding is limited, and a lot of funding goes to other things and not necessarily the volunteer program. So finding cost-effective ways to do that is great. So if anyone has any questions, I'm going to hang around. Feel free to type them into the chat box. I can unmute lines as well if anyone has anything that they want to say and discuss. I appreciate you all being on, listening to me talk as always. So I'm working still on unmuting people. I can hear some discussions in the background, so I may mute some people again, but what questions do we all have, if anybody has any? I'll put my information on the screen as well. Anybody have any questions or anything they want to discuss?
No.
In there.
All righty. Thank you all so much again.
Wow.